We were only supposed to stop for a minute, just long enough to catch our breath before getting back on the road. But when the engine didn't start and the lights around us went out one by one, I understood something too late. This wasn't a place you passed through. It was a place that decided when you could leave. I didn't mean to take the wrong road. And that's the part that still bothers me the most. Because it wasn't a decision made out of curiosity or recklessness. It was the kind of choice anyone would make when they're tired, low on gas, and just trying to get home. The kind of choice that feels reasonable right up until the moment you realize you've stepped slightly out of alignment with the world you know, and things stop behaving the way they're supposed to. I was driving from Albuquerque back to Flagstaff in early October. Not late enough in the year for snow, but far enough into fall that the desert felt hollowed out and quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful so much as empty. And I had taken the trip dozens of times before, usually without thinking. But that night was different because my dad had just died 2 weeks earlier, and I hadn't really processed it yet. I was still in that numb, practical phase where you keep moving because stopping feels dangerous, and the road, long and dark and familiar, felt like the only thing that wasn't asking anything from me. I left Albuquerque later than I should have, after helping my sister box up some of his things, and by the time I hit I-40 westbound, the sky was already fully dark. No lingering sunset, just a hard black dome overhead with stars that felt sharper than usual, like they were closer, watching. I remember thinking, somewhere near Gallup, that the radio sounded off, not broken exactly, just thin, like the signal was stretched too far. The music warbling in and out, voices flattening into static. And when I reached for the dial, I noticed my hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, I told myself. Just exhaustion, grief catching up to me in small, physical ways. Around that time, my GPS rerouted, which wasn't unusual because there was construction along one stretch of the highway, but the notification tone sounded louder than it should have. Almost sharp, and the screen flashed briefly before settling on a new route that shaved off about 20 minutes. According to the estimate, directing me to exit onto a state road I didn't immediately recognize, but I trusted it because I always had, because the map on the screen looked clean and confident. A single pale line branching off into the dark, like it knew exactly where it was going. The exit came up fast. A green sign with reflective lettering that read simply, County Road 117. No town names, no distances, just the number, and something about that struck me as odd even as I signaled and took the ramp, because most exits out there at least gesture towards civilization, even if it's just a dot on the map with a name you've never heard before. The ramp curved away from the highway, and the sound of other cars faded almost immediately, replaced by the low, constant hum of my own tires on asphalt that felt older, rougher, like it hadn't been resurfaced in years. And within a minute, I was alone. The highway gone behind me, the desert pressing in on both sides, darker and more uneven than it had been from the main road. At first, everything seemed fine. Normal even, the GPS arrow moving steadily along the line, the distance ticking down. But after about 10 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle since the exit. Not headlights in the distance, not taillights ahead, nothing. And while that wasn't impossible, given the hour and the location, it was uncommon enough that I turned down the radio, listening to the road itself, to the subtle shifts in sound that tell you whether you're still connected to the larger world. The road was too clean, I noticed then. Not in terms of maintenance, but in its emptiness. No debris, no tire marks on the shoulder, no dead animals, no trash, not even the usual scatter of rocks and weeds that creep in from the edges. And the reflectors along the center line caught my headlights in a way that felt deliberate, evenly spaced, perfectly aligned, as if they were newer than the rest of the road, installed by someone who cared a little too much about precision. The GPS didn't say anything, no recalculating, no warnings, just the calm, digital voice telling me to continue straight for several miles, and I did, because turning around felt like an overreaction, and because I didn't yet feel afraid, just mildly unsettled in the way you get when something is slightly off, but not wrong enough to demand action. It was when the radio cut out completely that I first considered stopping. Not even static, just silence. The display still lit, the numbers still there, but no sound coming through the speakers. And when I flipped through stations, they all did the same thing. As if I were scanning across a band that had been erased. I tried Bluetooth next, pulling up a podcast I'd downloaded earlier. Something familiar and low-key, but the audio stuttered and refused to play. The loading icon spinning uselessly, and I remember laughing softly to myself, a short, humorless sound, and saying out loud, "Of course," because it felt like the kind of minor inconvenience the universe throws at you when you're already worn thin. Just another small thing to deal with. The road began to curve more sharply then, dipping slightly, and I noticed that the desert around me had changed, the scrub giving way to taller, denser clusters of trees, not forest exactly, but more than I expected at that elevation. Their branches reaching inward toward the road in a way that made the darkness feel closer, heavier. And when I glanced back at the GPS, I saw that the line representing the road I was on had grown faint, almost translucent, while the rest of the map remained bright and clear, a detail so subtle I almost missed it. And when I zoomed out, trying to get a better sense of where I was, the screen lagged, then snapped back to the original scale, as if it didn't want me looking too closely. I told myself it was just bad reception, that rural roads mess with signals all the time. But the explanation felt thin even as I thought it, like I was repeating something I'd heard before rather than something I truly believed. About 5 minutes later, I saw the first sign of anything resembling a destination. A small, rectangular sign on the right side of the road. Unlit, its white paint dulled by age, with black letters that read Henson Creek. No distance marker, no arrow, just the name. And I slowed instinctively, scanning the area for any sign of buildings or side roads. But there was nothing, just trees and darkness. The road stretching ahead in a narrow ribbon. And as I passed the sign, I felt a brief, inexplicable sense of loss, like I'd missed something important without realizing it. That was when I checked the time and noticed that nearly 40 minutes had passed since I exited the highway, far longer than the GPS's original estimate, and yet the distance remaining hadn't changed in proportion, still claiming I'd be home in just under an hour. And that discrepancy, small as it was, finally pierced through my fog of distraction and grief. A sharp, cold point of awareness that made my chest tighten. I tried to turn around then, easing off the accelerator and looking for a place wide enough to make a 3-point turn. But the shoulders had narrowed, the drop-off on either side steeper than before, and as I slowed further, I realized that the darkness ahead seemed to deepen in response. Not like the road was ending, but like my headlights were being absorbed, their reach shortening in a way that made distance hard to judge. It was then that I noticed the smell, faint at first, something damp and mineral, like wet stone or cold earth, completely out of place in the dry desert air, and I cracked a window, just an inch, to see if it was coming from outside, only to slam it shut again almost immediately. When the smell intensified, thick and heavy, carrying with it a subtle undercurrent I couldn't quite identify, but instinctively recoiled from, something old and stagnant, like a room that had been sealed for too long. My heart was beating faster now, not panicked, but alert, and I remember thinking of my dad, of how he used to tell me to trust my instincts when something didn't feel right. Not in a mystical way, just as a practical rule for getting through life. And the memory hit me harder than I expected, a sudden swell of grief and longing that blurred my vision for a second as tears welled up. And in that moment of distraction, the road dipped sharply and my car lurched, the headlights catching on something reflective ahead that resolved into another sign. Larger this time, mounted on 2 wooden posts, reading, "Welcome to Henson Creek." The letters uneven, the paint chipped, the word "welcome" sagging slightly, as if the sign itself were tired. Beyond it, the road widened briefly, opening into what looked like a small town center. A handful of buildings clustered around a bend, their silhouettes dark against the night sky, and I slowed to a crawl, my pulse loud in my ears, scanning for movement, for light, for anything that would make this feel real and inhabited. There were streetlights, but they were dim, their yellow glow barely illuminating the cracked pavement beneath them. And the buildings, a gas station, a diner, a motel with a flickering vacancy sign, all looked abandoned at first glance, until I noticed that the gas station canopy lights were on, casting a harsh white glow over the pumps, and that the diner had a single light burning inside, a dull amber rectangle in the dark. I pulled into the gas station, more out of a need to stop and think than any real intention to refuel. And as my tires rolled over the concrete, I was struck by how clean it was. No oil stains, no trash, no signs of recent use. And when I shut off the engine, the sudden silence felt oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening. But there were no ambient sounds, no insects, no distant traffic, not even wind through the trees, just a deep, muffled stillness that made my ears ring. I got out of the car slowly, half expecting the night air to feel different, heavier or colder. But it was unremarkable, cool and dry, and the smell from before was gone, replaced by the faint, metallic scent of gasoline. The pump didn't respond when I lifted the nozzle, the screen blank, the buttons dead. And when I glanced toward the small office, I saw that the door was open, a sliver of light spilling out onto the concrete. And after a moment's hesitation, I walked toward it, my footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet. Inside, the office was small and sparse. A counter, a register, a rack of outdated snacks. And behind the counter stood a man, middle-aged, maybe older, his hair thinning, his face lined in a way that suggested hard years rather than age. And he looked at me with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just neutral, as if he'd been expecting me. I asked him if the pumps were working, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, too loud, and he nodded once, slowly, then said, "They don't always respond right away." His voice flat, his eyes never leaving mine. And something about the way he said it made me feel like he wasn't talking about machinery at all. I asked him where I was, if Henson Creek was still in Arizona, or if I'd crossed into New Mexico somehow without realizing it. And at that, his expression shifted slightly, not into confusion, but into something like concern. And he said, "You should head back the way you came." Not unkindly, but firmly. And when I told him that the road I came in on didn't seem to be on my map anymore, he glanced past me toward the dark beyond the doorway, and for just a second, I thought I saw something like fear flicker across his face. "It won't be if you look too hard," he said. And before I could ask what that meant, a sound came from outside. A low, distant hum, like an engine idling far away. And the man's shoulders tensed. "You need to go," he said, more urgently now. And I didn't argue, turning and hurrying back to my car, my unease blooming into something closer to dread, as I noticed that the town, which had felt empty when I arrived, now seemed to be watching me. The dark windows of the buildings reflecting my movement, the streetlights buzzing faintly, their glow pulsing ever so slightly, like a slow, uneven heartbeat. I got into my car and started the engine, relief flooding me when it turned over without issue, and I backed out of the gas station, turning back toward the road I'd come in on, only to find that it was no longer there. The space where it should have been occupied by a row of trees, their trunks close together, their branches interlaced, forming a solid wall of darkness that hadn't been there moments before. I sat there, stunned, my mind scrambling for explanations, for anything that made sense. And when I shifted into drive and eased forward, hoping to find another way out, the GPS chimed softly, rerouting again, the screen now showing a looping path that led deeper into the town, through streets that hadn't existed before, their names unfamiliar, their lines drawn in the same faint, translucent style as the road that had brought me here. Panic threatened then, a tightness in my chest, a buzzing in my limbs. But I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the physical, on the feel of the steering wheel under my hands, the hum of the engine, the way the headlights cut through the darkness ahead, because giving in to fear felt like the worst thing I could do. I drove slowly through the town, past the diner, past the motel, past houses that looked lived in but unoccupied, their porches swept, their curtains drawn, their mailboxes empty, and with each block, the sense of wrongness deepened. A pressure building behind my eyes, a feeling that I was being gently but inexorably guided, somewhere I didn't want to go. The road narrowed again, the buildings thinning out until I was back among trees. And then, abruptly, the town was behind me, the road opening up into a straight stretch that looked eerily similar to the one I'd been on before. The same reflectors, the same too clean asphalt, the same oppressive quiet. The GPS fell silent, the screen going dark, and my headlights flickered once, briefly, before stabilizing. And in that moment I knew, with a certainty that felt almost calm, that I was no longer trying to get home, that whatever rules governed this place were not the ones I understood, and that the only thing I could do was keep moving. I drove for what felt like hours, though my sense of time had become unreliable, the road unchanging, the darkness unbroken. And as I went, I thought about my dad, about the things I wished I'd said to him, the conversations we'd never have, and the grief that had driven me onto this road in the first place. A grief that now felt mirrored by the landscape around me, empty, unresolved, stretching on without clear boundaries. Eventually, the road began to fade, not ending so much as thinning, the asphalt giving way to dirt, then to nothing at all, and I slowed, my heart pounding, until I was barely creeping forward, my headlights illuminating only scrub and rock. And then, without warning, I was back on I-40, the familiar yellow lines rushing beneath me, the roar of passing trucks filling the air, the GPS lighting up with a cheerful chime, announcing my arrival in Flagstaff in 32 minutes. I pulled over at the next rest stop and sat there shaking, the enormity of what had happened crashing down on me all at once. And when I checked the time, I saw that only 20 minutes had passed since I'd exited the highway, a physical impossibility that made my head spin. I told myself, over and over, that I'd imagined it, that grief and exhaustion had played tricks on my mind, that there was a logical explanation I just hadn't found yet. And for a while, that was enough. But months later, after I'd settled back into something resembling normal life, after the sharp edges of my grief had dulled, I tried to find Henson Creek on a map, any map, digital or physical, and found nothing. No record of the town, no mention of County Road 117, no sign that the place I'd been had ever existed at all. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving and the radio cuts out for no reason, or the GPS hesitates a little too long before rerouting, I feel that same tightness in my chest, that same sense of being watched, and I know, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that the road I took is still out there, waiting just beyond the edges of the map for anyone tired enough, lost enough to follow it. I stopped at the gas station because the sign told me I should, not because I felt like it, not because I needed a break, but because after 3 hours on U.S. Route 50 heading west out of Ely, Nevada, with the sun already gone and the desert cooling into that quiet, hollow stillness it gets at night, a weathered green sign on the shoulder read, "Next services 108 miles," and beneath it, smaller and almost apologetic, "Last gas station before nowhere." And I remember thinking that the phrasing was dramatic, in a way only rural signage ever is, half warning, half joke. But my fuel gauge was already dipping below a quarter, and I had learned the hard way not to test distances in Nevada, especially alone, especially at night, especially when you're driving not to get somewhere new, but to outrun something familiar. Like the slow collapse of a relationship you already know is over. I had left Salt Lake City that morning after a fight that didn't feel explosive or final, just tired, the kind of argument that ends with both people saying less than they mean because they've already said everything before. And when I packed the car, I told myself I was just taking a few days, heading back to California to clear my head. But somewhere between Delta and Ely, I admitted what I was really doing was avoiding the conversation that would follow if I stayed, the one where we'd have to decide whether taking space was just a softer way of saying goodbye. The road out of Ely had been empty almost immediately, the town lights fading in my rearview mirror until there was nothing but darkness and the faint, rhythmic click of reflectors passing under my headlights. And I'd turned the radio low, some late-night talk show bleeding in and out of static, the host's voice stretched thin by distance. And I let it play because silence felt worse, because silence left room for thoughts I wasn't ready to finish. When the gas station came into view, it didn't look like much. Just a low, flat building set back from the road, a pair of pumps under a canopy that hummed faintly, their fluorescent lights casting a pale, almost clinical glow on the cracked concrete. And beyond that, nothing. No other buildings, no houses, no town sign. just the road continuing west into a darker, thicker stretch of night. I pulled in slowly, my tires crunching over gravel at the edge of the pavement, and noticed immediately how clean the place was. Not modern or well-maintained, just untouched, like no one had been there long enough to leave a mark. And when I shut off the engine, the quiet pressed in, so suddenly it made my ears ring, the radio cutting out mid-sentence as if someone had reached over and turned it off for me. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, watching my breath fog faintly on the windshield, telling myself this was normal, that small gas stations like this existed all over the country, that the unease I felt was just the accumulated weight of a long day and an unresolved goodbye. And then I got out of the car, and the smell hit me. Not gasoline, not oil, but something damp and metallic, like cold water pooled over stone. And it didn't belong out there in the high desert. Not at that elevation. Not with the air so dry it usually felt sharp in your lungs. The pump didn't respond when I lifted the nozzle, the screen dark, the handle heavy in my hand. And when I tried the other pump, it was the same, dead and unresponsive. And that's when I noticed the office door was open. A narrow rectangle of yellow light spilling out onto the concrete. And inside, behind the counter, stood a man who hadn't made a sound when I pulled in, who hadn't looked up until I was already standing there. And when he did, his eyes settled on me with an intensity that made me feel like I'd interrupted something. He was older, maybe late 50s or early 60s, his hair thin and gray, his face lined in a way that suggested years of sun and wind, and he wore a plain button-down shirt tucked neatly into jeans that looked too clean for the job. And when I asked if the pumps were working, he nodded once, slowly, and said, "They will," like it was a matter of patience rather than function. I told him the screens were dark, and he glanced at them briefly, then back at me, and said, "They come on when they need to." And the way he said it, calm and unbothered, made me feel like I was the one misunderstanding the situation, like I was applying the wrong rules to a place that operated on its own quiet logic. I asked him how far it was to the next town, and he paused before answering, his gaze drifting past me toward the road. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more measured. "Depends on how you drive," he said. And then, after a moment, "Depends on whether you stop." That should have been the point where I laughed it off, where I recognized the comment as small-town humor, the kind of dry understatement people use to fill the space when there's nothing else to say. But something in his expression stopped me. A tension around his eyes, a restraint that felt deliberate. And I found myself asking, is there something wrong with the road? He didn't answer right away. And in that silence, the hum of the canopy lights grew louder, more insistent. And I became aware of how alone we were, how far removed this place was from anything that could intervene if things went wrong. "Finally," he said, "people get turned around out there." And when I pressed him, asking what he meant, he shook his head slightly and said, "Not my place to explain it." I paid for the gas even though I hadn't pumped any yet, sliding my card across the counter. And when he handed it back, our fingers brushed briefly, his skin cold, almost damp, and he looked at me then with something like concern, like he was weighing whether to say more. "Don't linger," he said quietly, and I nodded, more to end the conversation than because I understood, and stepped back outside, the night closing in around me like a held breath. The pump screen flickered to life as soon as I lifted the nozzle again, the numbers resetting, the machine whirring softly. and as I filled the tank, I watched the road, half expecting to see headlights cresting the rise in the distance. But there was nothing, just darkness layered on darkness. The stars overhead sharp and unmoving. When the tank was full, I replaced the nozzle and got back in the car, starting the engine with a sense of relief that surprised me with its intensity. And as I pulled back onto the road, I glanced in the mirror and saw the man still standing in the doorway, watching me leave, his figure growing smaller until it was swallowed by the dark. The first few miles felt normal enough, the road straight and empty, the reflectors ticking by at a steady pace. But then the radio cut out again, not fading into static this time, just going dead, the display still lit but silent. And when I tried to switch stations, nothing happened. The buttons unresponsive, and I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the early edge of anxiety I'd learned to recognize but not always control. I told myself it was just poor reception, that I was deep enough into the basin that signals couldn't reach, and I focused on the road, on the simple act of driving. But then I noticed that the mile markers weren't changing, that the same number kept appearing in my headlights. And when I slowed to check, the next marker was the same, and the next, as if I were passing the same point over and over again. I checked the GPS, expecting to see it recalculating, maybe frozen, but the map looked normal at first glance. The route laid out cleanly, the estimated time unchanged, and then I realized that the line representing the road ahead had grown faint, almost translucent, like it was losing definition the farther it went. And when I zoomed out, the screen lagged, then snapped back to its original scale, refusing to show me anything beyond a few miles. The air in the car felt heavier then, thicker, and I cracked the window just enough to let in some fresh air, only to slam it shut again when that damp, mineral smell seeped in, stronger than before, carrying with it a sense of enclosed space, of something old and sealed. And my heart began to race, my thoughts scattering, looking for explanations that felt increasingly flimsy. I tried to turn around, signaling and easing onto the shoulder, but the road seemed narrower than it had before, the drop-off steeper, and when I steered into a three-point turn, my headlights caught on something ahead that hadn't been there moments before, a low structure set back from the road, its outline familiar in a way that made my stomach drop even before I recognized it. It was the gas station, the same canopy lights humming, the same cracked concrete, the same building crouched in the dark. And I slammed the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a stop, my pulse pounding in my ears. I sat there, staring, my mind rejecting what my eyes were telling me. And then, slowly, I drove forward, pulling into the lot again. Every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that places didn't loop back on themselves like this, that roads didn't fold inward. But I needed confirmation, needed to know I wasn't losing my grip on reality. The pumps were lit, the office door open, and the man stood behind the counter as before. And when he saw me, his expression didn't change, not surprise, not confusion, just a quiet resignation. "You shouldn't have stopped the first time," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. And I felt a surge of anger then, sharp and sudden, cutting through my fear. I demanded to know what was going on, where the road led, why I was back there. And he listened without interrupting, his eyes steady on mine. And when I finished, he sighed softly and said, "This is the last place people remember." And when I asked him what that meant, he shook his head. "If I explain it, it won't help you," he said. And there was something in his voice then, a weariness that felt earned, like he'd had this conversation before, too many times. I told him I just wanted to leave, to get back to the highway. And he nodded, stepping out from behind the counter and gesturing toward the door. "Then don't stop again," he said. And I wanted to ask him why he stayed, why he worked there if he knew what happened to people who passed through. But the question died in my throat when I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, that he wasn't working there. Not really. That he was as much a part of the place as the pumps and the lights, as fixed and unmoving as the road itself. I got back in the car and drove. Faster this time, the fear lending my movements a frantic edge. And the road stretched out ahead of me, unbroken, the reflectors flashing by in a steady rhythm, and I focused on that rhythm, on the simple forward motion, telling myself that if I just kept going, if I didn't look back, didn't slow down, I'd break free. The radio crackled briefly, a burst of static resolving into a fragment of a voice, too distorted to make out words. And then it was gone again, and the mile markers continued to repeat, the same number appearing over and over, mocking my progress. Time lost meaning, minutes stretching into something elastic and unreliable, and my thoughts drifted back to the argument I'd left behind, to the way she'd looked at me when I said I needed space, the hurt she'd tried to hide, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this road, this endless stretch of nowhere, felt like a physical manifestation of that avoidance, that refusal to confront what waited if I stopped running. The headlights began to dim, not failing, just softening, their reach shortening until the darkness ahead felt closer, more immediate. And when I glanced at the fuel gauge, I saw that it was dropping, the needle sinking faster than it should have, and panic flared again, hot and urgent. I pressed the accelerator, the engine responding with a strained whine. And then, impossibly, I saw the glow of lights ahead, the familiar outline of the gas station emerging from the dark for the third time, and something inside me broke. A quiet, defeated understanding settling over me like a weight. I pulled in one last time, the car rolling to a stop beneath the canopy, and I didn't bother turning off the engine as I got out, my legs heavy, my movements slow. And when I went inside the office, the man looked at me with something like sympathy. "You can rest here," he said softly, and the way he said it made my chest ache, made the exhaustion I'd been pushing aside crash down all at once. And for a moment, just a moment, the idea of stopping, of letting the road have me, felt almost comforting. I thought of the life I'd left paused somewhere east of there, of the conversations waiting if I turned back, of the fear of endings and beginnings alike. And I realized that this place thrived on that hesitation, on the moments when people chose stillness over motion, avoidance over confrontation. I shook my head, backing toward the door, and he didn't stop me, just watched as I got back in the car, his expression unreadable. I don't remember the drive after that, not clearly, just the sensation of movement, of darkness rushing past, and then, abruptly, the roar of traffic, headlights streaking by, the road widening beneath my tires, and I was back on US Route 50. The familiar signs reappearing, the radio blaring to life mid-song like it had never been silent at all. I pulled over at the first turnout and sat there shaking, the enormity of it pressing in on me. And when I checked the time, I saw that less than half an hour had passed since I'd first stopped for gas, a discrepancy that made my head spin. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, not stopping again, not even when my bladder protested. And when I finally reached California, the landscape felt unreal, like a set piece, something I was only passing through. I never told anyone what happened, not in detail, because I didn't have the language for it, because explaining it would require naming things I wasn't ready to name, and because some part of me understood that the road didn't need belief to exist. Even now, years later, when I see a sign warning of long distances without services, when I pass a lone gas station glowing in the dark, I feel that same tightening in my chest, that same pull to stop, and I know that somewhere out there, beyond the edges of the map, the last gas station before nowhere is still waiting. Its lights humming softly, its doors open, ready for anyone who isn't quite ready to face what comes next. We stopped in the town because my wife was tired, because our gas was lower than I liked, and because the rain that had been trailing us through the mountains of West Virginia finally turned heavy enough that continuing felt more reckless than pulling off, even though the sign we passed a mile back hadn't listed a name. Just a faded brown placard that said town limits in block letters with no distance marker beneath it, the kind of sign you don't really process until it's already behind you. And I remember thinking that was odd, but not odd enough to matter at the time. We had been driving since early morning, coming down from Pittsburgh toward Asheville, trying to make a quiet weekend out of a year that had been anything but. And the plan had been simple: take the scenic route, stop when we felt like it. Let the drive be the point instead of the destination. Because after 12 months of hospital rooms and tense phone calls and learning how to speak carefully around grief, we wanted something that felt unstructured, something that didn't demand constant attention. The rain changed that, though, turned the narrow 2-lane road slick and reflective, the trees closing in tighter as the light drained out of the sky earlier than expected. And when we saw the glow ahead, warm and yellow through the mist, it felt like relief, like a decision made for us. The town itself was small, just a handful of buildings clustered along a main street that curved slightly downhill, their windows lit but muted, the streetlights spaced evenly, casting overlapping pools of light on wet pavement. And as we rolled in, I noticed how quiet it was. No music spilling from doorways, no voices carrying through the rain, just the steady hiss of water on asphalt and the soft thump of our tires. We parked in front of what looked like a diner, the kind you see in postcards, long and low with a neon sign that buzzed faintly. And as I shut off the engine, I felt that familiar hesitation, the one that creeps in when you arrive somewhere unfamiliar and realize you're about to step into someone else's routine, someone else's normal. But I shook it off and got out, circling around to help my wife with her door as the rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and something fried, comforting in a way that hit me harder than I expected. And for a brief moment, I thought we'd found exactly what we needed: a quiet place to sit, warm up, eat something simple, and then be on our way. The room was mostly empty, just a few booths occupied. And when the door closed behind us, every head turned in unison, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. Enough that the air seemed to shift. The low murmur of conversation dropping off, as if someone had turned down a dial. It wasn't hostile exactly, just attentive, like we'd walked onto a stage without realizing it. And as we stood there dripping rain onto the tile, a woman behind the counter looked at us with an expression that hovered somewhere between surprise and concern. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just wiped her hands on a towel and said, "Kitchen's closing soon," in a tone that suggested she wasn't used to saying it to strangers. I told her we wouldn't be long, that we just needed a quick meal, and she nodded once, gesturing toward an empty booth near the window. And as we slid into the vinyl seats, I became aware of the way the other customers had gone back to what they were doing. But not completely. Their conversations quieter now, their glances more frequent, like they were checking to make sure we were still there. My wife noticed it too. I could tell by the way she leaned in closer than necessary, her voice low as she said, "Do you feel that?" And I nodded, not wanting to say too much, not wanting to amplify it, because unease has a way of feeding on itself. If you give it room. The food came quickly, burgers and fries, steaming and unremarkable. And for a few minutes, we focused on that, on the simple act of eating, letting the warmth spread through us, the rain streaking down the windows in thick, uneven lines that distorted the view of the street outside. It was only when I glanced up and noticed the clock on the wall that I felt that first real prickle of concern, because the hands hadn't moved since we'd sat down. The second hand frozen just past the 12, and when I checked my phone, it showed no service. The time grayed out, replaced with a spinning icon that never resolved. I told myself it was nothing, that old clocks break and rural towns have spotty reception. But when I mentioned it to the woman at the counter, she followed my gaze, then looked back at me with a faint crease between her brows. "It'll catch up," she said. And something about the phrasing made my stomach tighten, because it sounded less like reassurance and more like inevitability. When we finished eating, I paid in cash, the bills damp from my pocket, and as I stood to leave, I noticed that the rain had eased outside, not stopped entirely, but softened into a fine mist that hung in the air, blurring the edges of the streetlights and making the town feel smaller somehow, more enclosed. We stepped back onto the sidewalk, and I took a deep breath, expecting that sense of release you get when you leave a place that's been pressing in on you. But it didn't come. The air still heavy, still expectant, and as we walked toward the car, I realized that the street was empty now. The diner windows dark, the neon sign flickering weakly before going out, one by one. The lights in the surrounding buildings dimming until only the streetlights remained. I unlocked the car and pulled open my door, and that's when my wife stopped, her hand still on the handle, her gaze fixed down the street. "Did you hear that?" she asked, and I listened, straining past the soft patter of mist, and caught it. Then, a low, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from somewhere I couldn't quite place. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving the silence thicker than before. And when I looked up, I saw figures standing beneath the streetlights, people I hadn't noticed moments earlier, their faces indistinct in the glow, their bodies still. No one spoke, no one moved toward us, they just stood there, watching. And the sensation that washed over me then was not fear so much as realization. A sudden, cold understanding that whatever rules governed this place, we had already broken one simply by being there. I got into the car quickly, my movements jerky, and as I started the engine, I felt a rush of relief when it turned over without hesitation. The familiar vibration grounding me in something solid and known. I put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, the tires hissing softly on wet pavement. And as we passed the figures under the streetlights, I caught glimpses of faces turned toward us, their expressions unreadable. Not angry, not curious, just intent, like they were witnessing something that had already been decided. The road out of town climbed gently, curving back into the trees, and I pressed the accelerator, eager to put distance between us and whatever that was. But after a few minutes, I noticed that the road signs looked familiar. Too familiar. The same curve, the same cluster of trees leaning inward, and my heart began to pound as I realized we were heading back toward the town instead of away from it. I slowed, checking for turnoffs, for any sign that we could correct the mistake. But the road offered nothing, just the same narrow stretch repeating itself. And when the glow of the streetlights appeared ahead again, my wife let out a soft, involuntary sound. Halfway between a gasp and a sob, we rolled back into town from the opposite direction. The buildings unchanged, the streetlights humming softly, and I felt a wave of frustration then, sharp and hot, overriding my fear as I pulled over and shut off the engine. "This is ridiculous," I said, more to myself than to her, and got out of the car despite the way every instinct screamed not to. The mist soaking into my clothes as I stood there, hands clenched at my sides. The figures were closer now, no longer confined to the edges of the street, some of them standing in doorways, others near the corners, and I could see their faces more clearly. Ordinary faces, tired, lined, eyes reflecting the streetlight in a way that made them look flat, almost hollow. One of them, an older man with a cap pulled low over his brow, stepped forward slightly and said, "You shouldn't stay." His voice quiet, not threatening, just matter of fact. And I asked him what he meant, why the road kept looping back. And he shook his head, looking past me toward the car, where my wife sat rigid, watching. "It's not for you," he said. And when I pressed him, demanded an explanation, he sighed and added, "It doesn't like strangers lingering." That was the first time anyone used the word like, and it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the damp, because it implied intention, preference, something that could be offended. I backed away then, returning to the car, and as I got in, I noticed that the figures had retreated slightly, giving us space, not blocking our path, and that frightened me more than if they had, because it felt like permission rather than resistance. I started the engine again and drove, slower this time, more deliberate, paying close attention to every turn, every marker. But the road behaved the same way, folding back on itself, depositing us at the edge of town again and again, each loop accompanied by subtle changes, a building missing here, a light out there, the figures closer, their patience thinning. Time became slippery, my sense of it eroding as my phone remained useless, the car clock blinking intermittently before going dark, and with each return the town felt less like a place and more like a state, something we were sinking into rather than passing through. I thought about why we were there, about the way we'd been drifting for months, circling the same arguments, avoiding decisions, and a terrible thought took hold, that this town existed for people like us, people stuck between leaving and staying, people who paused too long in the wrong place. On what felt like the final loop, the car sputtered as we rolled into town, the engine losing power, and panic flared as I fought to keep it running, the headlights dimming, the figures stepping closer, their faces softening into expressions that almost looked sympathetic. My wife reached for my hand, her grip tight, and in that moment I understood that whatever this place wanted, it thrived on stillness. On the moment when motion stopped and choice gave way to acceptance, I slammed the accelerator, the engine protesting. And as the car lurched forward, I aimed not for the road, but for the darkness between two buildings, a narrow gap that looked like nothing. And as we plunged into it, the world seemed to stretch, to thin. The streetlights smearing into lines, the mist dissolving into cold air. And then, with a jolt that knocked the breath from my lungs, we were back on the highway, the rain gone, the stars sharp overhead, the town lights nowhere to be seen. I pulled over immediately, my hands shaking so badly I had to rest my head against the steering wheel. And when I looked at my phone, it buzzed back to life, messages flooding in, the time showing we'd been gone less than 20 minutes. We drove the rest of the night without stopping, without speaking much, the road stretching out ahead of us in a way that felt suddenly precious. And we never saw a sign for that town again. No matter how many maps we checked later, no matter how carefully we traced our route. Sometimes, though, when the rain is heavy and the road narrows and the light fades faster than it should, I feel that same pressure, that same sense of being observed. And I know there are places out there that don't want visitors. Places that wait quietly for the moment you slow down just enough to let them close in.